Welcome back to the channel. It's me, Eric. If you're new, please subscribe. Now, on today's video, we're gonna start the motor build for this Evo 10. I'm gonna show you guys how to build a 4B11. And this is gonna be like a 4-part series. Today's just episode 1. So it's mostly gonna be the technical specs on the block itself. It won't be a whole lot of assembly, but it's part of it, so I wanted to show you guys how I go through it and what my specs are. Alright, let's get into today's video. First thing we gotta do with any motor build is make sure that the block is extremely clean. When you get it back from the machine shop, there can be shavings in it from whatever machining that they've done to it. So you gotta make sure those shavings are not in there when you go to assemble it. So let's get to cleaning this block up. So now that we got the block thoroughly cleaned up, just use the little brake cleaner and then compressed air and try and clean out all the little holes, oil galleys, all that stuff. Make sure there's no debris inside the motor when you're putting it together. Now we can move on to the crank. Same thing, we got to get this cleaned up. So the little oil galleys that are in it, gonna shoot some brake cleaner in there and then just clean up all the whole thing.
That's me falling in and out so fast, holding you back, back, back. Guilty of the pain I caused and of the conscience I lack. I will hold your hand while I'm 1 foot out the door. And it's all because I don't need you.
So now that we got the crank cleaned up, we got ACL race bearings for the mains, just standard, and then ACL race bearings for the rods as well, and those are standard clearance. And then also the ACL thrush washers as well. And so what we got to do is we have to measure our tolerances and make sure that they're within spec. So first, we'll get these things cleaned up, and then I'm going to end up using this micrometer right here to measure these telescoping gauges that I have. This one's probably too big, but this one's too small. But we'll be using these telescoping gauges to measure our clearances. So we'll get these cleaned up first, and then we also have to install the ARP main studs back into the block, so that way we can install the bearings with the caps and get to measuring this stuff. So let's get into that. studs installed. They're just hand tight for right now. And then we cleaned up all the bearings. We're gonna place them in here and then also put the caps on as well. So we have all the main caps torqued down to spec, and just go off of ARP's recommended torque sequence, or sorry, torque specs, and use Mitsubishi's OEM torque sequence to get these things snugged down. So now that we got them snugged down with the bearings in, we got to measure the crank with the micrometer, and then we measure the bearings in the block with the T gauges, and yeah, I'll show you guys how to do that. So what you do is you take the micrometer, you put it on your crank, and you snug it up. And then you take it off, and what you do is you zero it out. There we go. Then you take your T gauge and you place it in here like so. Alright. You put it in your micrometer once you have that measured up, and you snug it up. There you go. So once you get that measurement, we just write it down on a piece of paper and then go through the rest of them and get them measured out. So let's do that. Okay, so I've got all of them measured out and they're within spec. I'm shooting for the main bearings around 0.02 to 2.2, I believe, and they all came in at 0.022, so we're good to go. Now we got to move on to the rod bearings. So let's get to cleaning up these rods, and I'll show you guys what rods I'm running on this build. So I'm running Eagle rods on this build, and I know on my Evo 9 I had a fully built block and it was making around 420, and I used the Eagle rods, and they handled all the abuse I threw at them. So yeah, for this build I'm doing a similar one, but for the Evo 10. So yep, we're gonna be doing this. So first thing we need to do is get these things cleaned up, and then we can get to popping these caps off and putting the bearings in and do the measurements. These all cleaned up and we have them separated. So now we just got to get the bearings placed in there and then torqued down to spec. Now they recommend for this size ARP bolt to torque it down to, let's see, 75 foot-pounds of torque. Alright, so I want to make sure that these are torqued down evenly. We're going to start with like 15 foot-pounds and then work our way up. So these things are all torqued down to spec and ready to go. So first thing we'll need to do is measure the crank where the rods connect, and we'll use the micrometer for that, and then we'll use the T-gauge on these to measure these to get our clearances. So let's do that. Similar to before, you just measure right on the crank and make sure that you don't put this on a oil galley, because that will definitely throw your readings off. So let's see, put this on here. All of them came within spec. I know Eagle says they can be anywhere from 0.015 to 0.035, but I'm gonna go close to what Mitsubishi spec is, and yeah, it looks like it's all good. So these are ready to be assembled, but first what we got to do is set the piston ring in gap. So I got a little bit ahead of myself, guys, and I apologize for that. When you send a block off to a machine shop, typically they want you to send the piston with it that you're going to be installing into the block. That way they can make sure they get the piston to wall clearance right when they bore out the engine. Now you should double check their work, make sure that it is right, because if it's not, and the tolerance isn't right to what the manufacturer specifies on those pistons, more than likely you're gonna have engine seize up. So if it's a little bit loose, they'll be fine, but you definitely don't want it to be tight on there. So you just need to go through the block with a T-gauge, check the bore, and then about, I think it's with the Wiseco pistons, they recommend about an inch, 1.3 inches below the lowest oil ring on the piston, and 90 degrees is where you measure the diameter of it, and then you subtract that from your bore, and that'll give you your piston to wall clearance. So I already went ahead and double checked all that stuff, and we should be good to go. Piston ring in gap. It is the final process before we get to assembling this engine. So what is it? Basically, I picked up some Wiseco 86.5 millimeter pistons, and they come with a set of rings, and what you want to do is set the end gap on those compression rings for your engine. And there's two compression rings, one kind of shiny one, that's the top one, and then a black one or a more dull one, that's the second one. And typically you want to have the top compression ring slightly tighter than the bottom one, and they do have a specification that comes with the pistons as to what your application is going to be, how much of a gap you want on those rings. So let's get to looking at this real quick. This is that top compression ring I was talking about. You can see it's a little bit shinier. Another note to take is that it's actually thinner than the second one as well. And when you try to go to put it in the piston, you'll realize they can only go one way. So what you want to do with this thing is you want to compress it just a little bit, or squeeze it just a little bit, so it will go down into the bore, and then you take your piston and you just slide this down in there about an inch, go. And take you off the stand here. You can see that there's a little gap right there, and you want to use a filler gauge to measure that. And right now I'm pretty sure that it's not the spec that we want, so I'm gonna get this thing measured out, and then what we'll do is we'll end up grinding it down to the spec that we want. So you can see, place your filler gauge in there, and yeah, that's like 0.015, and that's definitely not the spec that we're looking for, so we're gonna have to grind it down. I picked this thing up off of Amazon, and it's pretty inexpensive, and I recommend also picking up some jeweler files as well, so that way you can deburr it once you're done filing it. But yeah, basically you just put it on here and you run this thing out. You don't want to do like a whole bunch in one time. I'd say maybe 6 to 8 turns before you go measuring it again, because you don't want to take too much off. You can always do more, but once it's gone, it's gone. So yep, let's get to doing this. Also, just so you guys are aware, with these particular ones, there is, let me see if I can focus, a little in on the top of this thing. So that little letter will be facing upward on the piston. So just keep that in mind when you're filing these things down, that you're doing it the right way. So that's how it's done. The oil rings, the expander ring, you don't have to do anything with those. Out of the box, they're good to go. So let's get the rest of these all done and wrap up this video. I totally failed to mention that once you're done with the rings, put them back in the box, and I marked each box what piston and bore that they go to. So you don't want to mix all those up when you're done with it. So make sure you put those back in the right one when you go to assemble it. All the ringing gaps are set, so now we're ready for assembly. But that's going to be on the next episode. That's a wrap on this one. If you liked it, make sure you hit that like button and be sure to subscribe, because you're not going to miss this full build. Now, a couple things I would like to mention about the filer is that make sure when you're filing those rings that you only do one side of the ring. Don't go back and forth on it. That can make it very uneven, so just stick to one side and one side only. The other thing is on the ends, you want to check it every once in a while to make sure you're not getting off, that when they squeeze together that they are flat and one's not crooked. So those are only 2 little hints that I could give you, or tips I could give you with that. But yeah, until next time guys, alright, peace out.